Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. It's been a minute or two, so apologies for that. The reason is I was in a Lord of the Rings event 2 weeks ago, and last week I was doing some overtime. But with it being the end of the financial year, the NHS has decided that it doesn't want to give me any more money, so that'll be no more overtime as we head into British summertime. Now, British summertime is important because those of you who have been fans of the channel for a while, or at least listeners to the channel, will know that that means we will be doing the Wednesday night live streams. Now, I'm not going to be able to do one this Wednesday, I'm afraid, as I've already made plans. But from next Wednesday, join me at 6 o'clock. We will be doing some live streams. It's usually painting, but we get to hang out, have a good chat. It's actually my favourite part of the channel is doing the live streams. So they will be starting, unfortunately, not this coming Wednesday, but next Wednesday. So Wednesday the 9th of April. So all things considered, Wednesday the 9th of April will be the first live stream of the 2025 British summer period. So what I wanted to talk about today is kind of related to one of the projects I want to work on the live streams. I've decided that we're going to look at some more esoteric stuff during the live streams. We often do. We often look at things that are not quite the mainstream on those. And I want to look at some Indian and Egyptian stuff while we're doing that. Some of you may know I recently had holiday to Egypt, so that's got me in the Eastern mode, shall we say. The Orientalist in me has come out, so I want to look at painting. I've got some British Indian troops to paint. And I've also got some Ottomans and Mamelukes as well, particularly with the recent releases from the Perrys. Now, that segues very nicely into what I want to talk about today, which is to appeal, dear viewer, to your Napoleonic sensibilities and to make the case for looking at some early, and by early I mean particularly Revolutionary War, battles of the Napoleonic period. Now, I think there is not assumption necessarily, but I think there's an idea of the Napoleonic Wars that is set very much towards 1812, 1815. So when we think of Napoleonic soldiers, we think of shakos, we think of brass-clad carabineers, Napoleon himself on his white horse. We'll talk more about that later. And the Russians and the Prussians in their 1815 uniforms. I think that's when we think of the Napoleonic Wars, that's the image that's conjured up. And I think that's in no small part to the huge gravitational pull that the Battle of Waterloo has on the public imagination and on that of wargamers as well. For people who know a little bit more about the Napoleonic Wars, I think perhaps 1812 is going to be the thing that they know the most. But we've seen from the Perrys, they've had their Ottoman range has been expanded into the Egyptian troops, the Mamelukes, the Nizam, all that kind of good stuff. And they have just released their early war, their Revolutionary War French as well. So this is a video that's very much inspired by these two releases. I'm not saying that there's not options available elsewhere, and we may talk about that towards the end of the video. But the Perrys are the forefront of the Napoleonic scene, I think. Piano Miniatures doing an excellent job of pushing them out of the way, perhaps challenging them, and obviously Victrix and Warlord are there as well. But I think Perry set the tone, and I think this is why I was inspired to do this video, and I wanted to have a look first at why doing some early battles or collecting an army from the early period is worthwhile, why it's what its advantages over later armies are, and some disadvantages as well. And I wanted to look at 3 battles in particular that exemplify why doing the early period can be such a rewarding thing to do. Now, I think of those 3 battles, one of you might have heard of. If you've listened to my Prussian videos, you'll definitely have heard of it. One of them you've almost certainly heard of, and the other one I'm hoping is going to be a new one to you. But it does involve your boy Van Damme, so that's not the only reason why I've gone for that one. But it's a crucial part of it. So even if you're not that bothered about the collecting side of it, please listen to the end, because you might get some battles that you are perhaps unaware of. So in this video, we're going to be talking a lot about the French Revolutionary War. So that's distinct from what the Americans call the Revolutionary War, which was, of course, what we call the American War of Independence. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the war against the French when they first deposed Louis XVI. So I guess you could call it the War of the First Coalition as well. But it's more typically called the French Revolutionary Wars, at least in this country anyway. So what is the period from that? Well, the war broke out in 1792, and that was when the first coalition was formed. You're looking at something like the Battle of Verdun, the original Battle of Verdun, not the 1906 version, and that was between the Prussians and the French. So again, that's no jokes I'm going to make about that one. But you can probably start it there, and then it would officially end in, I guess, 1799 with the coup de Brumaire. So those of you who have seen the Napoleon film will know there's a very nice building. It's actually, ironically, where Nelson's body was laid in Greenwich College, where Napoleon and a load of troops come in, and then they sort of level their muskets at the senators and say, "Shall we vote?" That's the bit in the film. But it's when Napoleon went from being one of three consuls to being first consul on his way to being emperor. And that was towards the end. I think it was in October or September. It's weird because it's the revolutionary calendar, but that was in 1799. However, I am going to have both my cake and eat it because there's no bread, so let them eat cake instead. And I am going to run it to 1800. I'm going to be a bit naughty and expand it a year, and we'll find out later on why I've done that. So with the time period established, what are the benefits of collecting an army, or at least collecting towards an army, from this very early period as opposed to the later ones? Well, I think the first one is I'm going to start off by looking at things like the uniforms, and then we'll look at the rules later. So one of the things is with the uniforms, they are absolutely all over the place. As the Perrys can see, I'm going to cycle through the new Perry models on the screen. So normally I assume that you're not looking at the screen, you're doing some painting or like listening in the bath or whatever. But if you look on the screen, you can see some of the multicoloured trousers that the revolutionaries are wearing, or they can be white with blue stripes. That's called ticking. And it was originally made for mattress material, but they ended up making trousers out of them. You've got guys with bicorns on. You've got guys with those revolutionary hats. It's called a Phrygian cap. You've got ones with those on, or you've got even bareheaded ones. The Grenadiers at this time, they have bearskins, so that's pretty cool. If you've seen my video on the Swiss, the first part, we're looking at those uniforms as well. So you've got a real variety of troops, and because they are basically a militia, you can mix all those within units as well. So you can have guys with Phrygian caps next to a guy with a bicorn on, next to a guy with no headdress on, or maybe he's got a civilian hat on, like a top hat or something like that. These things you can all mix and match, and for those of you who like your units to not be uniform, this is an absolutely perfect period for you. Now, for those of you who do like your troops to be uniformed, this is also a perfect period for you. Just don't be French. You've got some absolutely fantastic uniforms on the Prussians. As we mentioned, they fought at the Battle of Verdun. They also fought at the Battle of Valmy, and we'll talk about that later on. So you've got those early 1806 style uniforms from the Prussians. Absolutely fantastic. You've also got access to one of my favourite uniforms of the whole Napoleonic period, and there's only one manufacturer I've seen so far that does these models. So, Lucas, if you're listening, this could well be your next project, and that is the Potemkin Army of Russia as well. They are phenomenal uniforms. I'll hopefully have some images of those on the screen now, because the models are by North Star, I think, and no, they're by Great War Miniatures. Sold by North Star. They are phenomenal uniforms. You probably get them from Brigade if you're in the US. And with the British, you've got some interesting uniforms as well. They're not quite as sort of industrial, shall we say, as they are by the end of the war. And you've got tarletans, and I love me a tarletan, so there's that as well. Speaking of cavalry headdress, The French Craziers also wore bicorns at this period, which I think just looks super cool. They did have like little metal skull caps underneath. But overall, yeah, they've got this bicorn on. I just think they look absolutely awesome. They look very out of place. I think they look great. So that's another thing you can do, and I may well be converting some of those up on the channel. The Austrians also have a different uniform. They're still white, but they've got this weird like baseball cap thing on. That I don't know. It's an odd hat to me. It's not to me. It's not as good as the helmets, but you know, it has their fans as well. So all the uniforms slightly different to what you would get in the later period. Now that said, if you are inspired to do an early battle, don't think you have to collect a new army. If you've got French guys in shakos with red cords on them as your grenadiers, use them. Yeah, as I often say to people, my bicorn French have fought from the sands of Egypt to the mud of Waterloo, and they've rolled just as many ones. It doesn't matter what battlefield they're fighting on. They are just as terrible when I'm commanding them. So I'm sure you'll have more success than me. But that's one of the uniform bonuses to doing some early period stuff. And the other one is you've got some kingdoms and some nations, I guess you could say, that don't exist later. So one of the probably the biggest one for that period is the Batavian Republic. It's basically Dutch Belgium, sort of. Before it became the Kingdom of Holland under Napoleon's brother, it was the Batavian Republic. So there's a little bit of variation in your uniforms that you can use there. If you're doing the Italian campaign, you've got some very nascent small city-states around there. Something like Venice or Genoa, they would have had their own militia. Rome, the Papal States, probably not. But, you know, you've got those independent, the Cisalpine Republic would be another example. So you've got those little independent states there that, you know, you can have a unit or two of from their army as well. I know General Dan has painted up a unit of troops that could be used as Venetians, but they're more like, his idea was that Constantinople hasn't fallen to the Ottomans. What would a 19th century Constantese army look like? Constantese? I guess that's what you call it, wouldn't it? I don't know. What would a 19th century version of their army look like anyway? General Dan started his process on that. You could also use Lucas's Tyrolean revolters. You could use those as revolters from the Vendée. I mean, they're slightly different. They wouldn't be wearing lederhosen and stuff like that. But seriously, I'm not sure anyone's gonna really care that much. I thought about using the new Wildermen of Dunland for Vendée crazies, but that's just me. I wouldn't really recommend that. So that's something else that you could do as well. So there's a lot of other smaller nations out there that get subsumed into the larger nations as the war goes on. And lest we forget, I've put this on my notes separately, you've also, on Malta, got the Knights of St. John. Now, they didn't fight Napoleon, but imagine if they did. That could have been quite cool as well. So you also have those available to you. Although if you've got a Russian army, they're available to you later on as well, but we won't get into that now. So overall, you've got a plethora of different uniforms that can be used for a number of different units, and you've got a load of different nations that perhaps didn't exist later or were just subsumed into wearing the same uniform as everyone else. So you've got that differentiation in troops, and this is where the second part of this, why would early games be interesting, is you've got a huge variation in training as well. This is particularly the case for the French. I'm going to focus on them because, I mean, they are the sort of the main protagonists of this. But during the Revolutionary Wars, they obviously raised the levy en masse, and their troops had a huge range of abilities and morale states. Because you've got to think at this period, some of the later great commanders of the Napoleonic Wars were still, you know, regimental officers or maybe even NCOs. Someone like General Augereau was the colonel of the German Legion, and I think he went the 11th Hussars he was in the Vendée with, or maybe just afterwards. He was a colonel there. So you've got these units with these people who would go on to be the greats, but they are freshly raised. And I use that term advisedly because a French Revolutionary Wars army should certainly have the freshly raised special rule. They could be full of patriotic fervour, of Vive la Révolution, or they could be ragtag and bobtail guys who've been thrown together by the local landowner, and they have no revolutionary ideals whatsoever. And what could be more fun than finding out where they lie on this spectrum than when the enemy are shooting at you? But no, seriously, and it does mean that you, as a French player, have that little bit more unsurety, that's not a word, but you know what I mean, about how your army is going to perform. And I would also suggest as well that you have a much lower strategy rating for your generals. Perhaps maybe even making it that half of them have to be strategy rating 6. Now, that is an interesting one because the French Revolutionary armies were actually quite aggressive, so it might make that more difficult. But then, by the same token, they also relied on their artillery. Now, this is for a good reason. And we're going to look at the Battle of Valmy as an example for this. So, during this battle, the French were on a ridge, and they absolutely poured fire into the Prussians as they were advancing. Now, the Prussians used to advance fairly slowly because they were still on basically a 7 Years' War timeline. So their troops would march at a relatively slow pace, making sure that the line was dressed correctly. So that means that the line was actually a straight line, making sure things like that were in place rather than rushing to get to grips with the enemy as the revolutionary French would. So General Kellerman, as he was then, Kellerman the Elder, he blasted the Prussians apart with artillery. And then the artillery ended up running. The Prussians, ended up running away. Now, the reason artillery was so good in the revolutionary French army is not really anything to do with Napoleon per se, but what happened during the revolution and the purge afterwards was many of the nobles fled the country because they were going to be on the pointy end of the guillotine if they didn't. Now, the artillery wasn't a nobleman's profession. The artillery belonged to the middle classes, and that's where Napoleon came from. He was very firmly middle class. It was seen as being almost a manual job. It was clearly skilled, but it wasn't seen as soldiering. It was seen more as a scientific part of being in the military. So it attracted a lot of middle class people. It was also in countries where buying commissions was a thing. It was it was also treated differently there as well. You couldn't just buy your way into artillery the way you would elsewhere. You had to have the correct qualifications first. It was far more like being in the Navy. And so when mobs of sans-culottes are rampaging around Paris looking for officers to grab and behead, they're not looking at the artillerymen because, as I say, they are middle class. They are not from the first estate. So again, very quickly, the French had 3 estates really. The first estate, the noblesse d'épée, they were the noblemen of the sword. They were the army officers who the revolution was after. The artillerymen were not part of that social class, so they maintained a good cadre of well-trained and experienced officers. The cavalry in particular had a large proportion of noblesse d'épée in them. They suffered hugely as all these officers and some of the gentlemen soldiers would leave to go and fight for particularly Austria or Russia. So, yeah, the artillery still pretty good at that period. Now, the Perrys haven't brought out revolutionary artillery yet. This follows their normal release schedule. They'll do line infantry. They've done some lights in this case as well. Then they'll probably do some cavalry, and then the artillery will come later. So I've got every faith that they will come later. You could currently use the French in Egypt if you wanted to, or you could buy some from Victrix, and we'll get onto some manufacturers more towards the end. So if you wanted to do Valmy, the key thing is that you have plenty of artillery, that you've got some infantry to back them up. The Prussians did get to the slope that the artillery was on, but then a bunch of crazed revolutionary fanatics appeared, and the Prussians were like, no, we don't fancy this. We'll come back another day, I think. So the infantry were important, but they never actually engaged with the Prussians to it. The Prussian infantry would have made short work, I suspect, of the French infantry. So this is a period where the French artillery is in the ascendancy over their infantry and cavalry. And again, that's something that later on in the Napoleonic Wars you don't quite see as much. Okay, you may have a grand battery, but you don't necessarily get the quality of the artillery being that much better than the infantry. It's something that is actually done for the Spanish army in Albion Triumphant Volume 1. The Spanish artillery is actually rated as being pretty good, and the Spanish infantry quite poor. The cavalry, even worse. So that might be a good starting off point. In fact, you may even just transport that directly over to a revolutionary French army, although I think it would lose some of its flavour. So Valmy is definitely one of the battles that you can do if you've got some Prussians lying around, ideally early Prussians, but if not, then you can go for later ones as well. It's not really a problem. I should also point out at this point as well that on the tabletop, the revolutionary armies look very cool as well. The flags are a big thing. Faces, bases, and flags, I once heard, are the three most important parts of wargaming models. And the revolutionary ones, they really stick out. I've seen a few Revolutionary War flags in Berlin Museum, actually. I'll see if I can find the photos for those and put them up. I may not be able to, but I'll have a look. And they are very different to any other flags that you see around. They're almost like workers' union flags as well. I always think of them looking like. But they are very cool. And on the tabletop, they also look awesome. One of the other good things as well is, of course, there's no real one flag per battalion, or demi-brigade as they would have been known then. So you can just bung as many flags on as you want, really. All right, you may have only one national, in inverted commas, colour, but you could have guys bringing their own like regional flags and all sorts of crazy stuff like that. So we've looked at it from the armies have a very different focus. They have a different approach perspective. That's great, particularly for the French. The Prussian infantry is still the building block there. Same with the British infantry, same with the Austrians. So they're all pretty much of a muchness. Although, having said that, Austrian artillery at that period should also be absolutely fantastic. We'll get more onto that in a second. But I wanted to look at the second reason why you might want to look at some early battles, at least for inspiration, if not, that's what you want to collect towards. And that is the wars of the First and Second Coalition. You've got some very odd matchups that you don't get later. Okay, later on, the War of the Third Coalition, you have the Austrians and the Russians fighting together. That's really good. It allows you to combine some collections together, get those games going on. That's what we like to see. So some of the crazy team-ups that you see in this period, I mean, there's some that are not so crazy and some that are just, what? So one of the ones that's a little less crazy is in 1794, in November. You've got the Battle of the Black Mountain, and that sees the French in the Pyrenees taking on a combined Spanish and Portuguese army. So that's pretty cool. Again, an early Portuguese army, something you don't see that often. The ones that you mostly see are post the reforms by the British under, I think it was General Colborne. And the Battle of the Black Mountain involves General Perignon, who he is a favourite of Epic History TV. They absolutely love him. So you'll have heard him on there. He's quite an interesting character. I may do a video on him one day. There's another battle that was fought over in the Ionian Peninsula, over in Greece, and that was the French fighting the Ottoman Albanians, old Ali Pasha of Janina. Now, what I like about that is that the French had a unit of Dalmatian Marines in their army. Now, in my head, they were obviously wearing black, white coats with black spots on, but I don't think they were. But that's another crazy battle. I don't really know much about that one. I shall have to. I did read into it a little bit when I was doing my research into the Ottomans, but I may have to read a bit more about that. I think I think it was near Corfu, so you should have the Greeks with those big pom-poms on their shoes as well. But and I love the idea of some Dalmatian Marines. I think that's pretty good. It was also fought. Now, there were a couple of battles that were fought within ruins. So the Battle of Alexandria or Abu Qir Bay, that was fought amongst the Greco-Roman ruins, but they were a very small part of the battlefield. The Battle of Nicopolis, which is this Ionian Greek one, that was fought in the ancient city of Nicopolis as well, which is super cool. If you collect Romans or Greeks or any of that kind of stuff, it's awesome to get that on the tabletop, because it really brings it, for me anyway, it brings in the memories of stuff like Jason the Argonauts and things like that as well, but in a Napoleonic setting. It's also really good for Silver Bayonet as well, but we'll talk about that another day, I think. But I think the most interesting alliance in this period comes in the War of the Second Coalition. Now, this is something that I didn't know a huge amount about. I knew the very, very bare bones of it, but I didn't know the specifics of this campaign. So the British landed in Holland during the War of the Second Coalition. Now, in Britain, we have a nursery rhyme called The Grand Old Duke of York. The Grand Old Duke of York, he had 10,000 men. He marched them up to the top of the hill, and he marched them down again. And when they were up, they were up. And when they were down, they were down. And when they were only halfway up, they were neither up or down. And that's basically making fun of the Duke of York for not really committing to one, attacking one way or the other. So his men ended up a little bit in no man's land. If you've listened to my videos on the Irish Legion, then it's the same area that we were talking about. There is where the British were. Now, this was, as I mentioned earlier on, the Batavians. So they were fighting against the French and the Batavians there. And they had the British, they had a Dutch expeditionary force, and they were also fighting alongside the Russians as well. So it was an Anglo-Russian invasion of Holland. Now, as I say, I don't know much about this at all. I had no idea that the Grand Old Duke of York had 10,000 men. I did not know that included Russians as well. So it's a really interesting campaign I'm going to have to look a lot more into. But what I can tell you is that there are two main battles there. The Battle of Castricum, which was a defeat by the French on the Russo-British. But far more importantly than that, we have the Battle of Alkmaar, because at the Battle of Alkmaar on the 2nd of October 1799 is your boy, General Van Damme. So that's what we like to see. We like a bit of Van Damme action going on. And basically, he was sort of not as successful as he might wanted to have been in this battle. The wing of the French army had been turned, but luckily the British soldiers were sinking up to their knees in the mud, and that rather slowed them down. So General Van Damme was able to redress the lines, and it didn't end in as much of a defeat as it should have been. It was a strategic victory for the Anglo-Russians due to Van Damme's ability to take control of the battlefield. It was originally under a Batavian general. He took control, and he managed to redress the lines and allow the French to withdraw. So that's the Battle of Alkmaar. I'm definitely going to be looking more into that. And we also have, so something that we haven't really talked about, and it's the reason we haven't talked about it yet is because it's another period I need to learn a lot more about, and that is Napoleon's Italian campaigns. Often people who are more learned than I are asked, what was Napoleon's greatest campaign? A lot of people will say his Italian campaign. You've got people like Massena and Murat, Lannes, people like that with him at the time. Saint-Cyr, I think, joins him later. But it's very much Napoleon's baby, that one. And I think, as I say, I don't know a huge amount about it, so I need to read more into it. I know that some of his strategic genius was on display there. He did quite a daring outflanking of the Austrians by crossing the River Po. That was something that you could see in his later campaigns, particularly in something like 1808. But so it's not something I know a lot about. I'm sure there'll be people in the comments who know far more about it than me, and they will say Napoleon's Italian campaign. The reason I don't want to go too much into it here is because I don't know enough about it. I haven't done the research yet. And secondly, I think it probably needs its own video, or maybe even a series of videos. If you want to know more about it, Epic History TV, I've already mentioned them. They've done an excellent series on Napoleon's Italian campaigns. Definitely check that out. But for me, the concept of having some Brits and Russians on the table fighting side by side is too good to pass up, particularly if they are in those awesome Potemkin uniforms. I'm not certain that they would be, but you know what? I want to buy some, so mine are going to be. And they're going to be fighting against the mighty Van Damme himself. So I'm really looking forward to delving into that battle. That's the Battle of Alkmaar. Now, it would also be an excellent little campaign to run as well. Now, speaking of landings and invasions, some of you will know I was the recent recipient of a Royal Naval box set. There is, of course, the glorious 1st of June takes place here. And there's quite a lot of other naval, not battles, that may be a little bit too grand, engagements, I think would be the best to say. There's a few of those over in the West Indies, particularly near Martinique. There was one as well. There was the battle just outside Hong Kong that I did with James. So this is also a great time for Napoleonic naval gamers, because this is before Britain got absolute hegemony of the seas. It was still all to play for at this time, and there's some interesting battles that take place there. I'm pushing the time frame a little bit, but 1801 we of course see the Battle of Copenhagen, the famous ships, Iceno ships from Nelson. So you can have the British against the Danish fleet there as well. Having talked about many of the unusual opponents that you can have against the French at this period, we haven't talked about their main opponent, and that is, of course, the Austrians. I did briefly mention the Italian campaign. That was, of course, against Austria, but they fought on other fronts as well. And perhaps the most famous early battle against the Austrians is Marengo. Now, many of you will have heard of Marengo, probably for two reasons. One, maybe three. One, it was often the first battle honour on many regiments' flags. The second one is that Napoleon's horse was called Marengo. And the third one is that in Waterloo he says that he lost the battle by 12 and won it back by 6 o'clock, or something like that. The times may not be right, but that's basically what he says. And again, it was General Kellerman that came to his rescue there. But Marengo is, for me, it's the first big set-piece Napoleonic battle. That, for me, Marengo is, it has many of the elements of later battles. It's got the absolute trifecta of infantry, cavalry, artillery. And it's on a battlefield, it is on a scale that only the Napoleonic Wars sees, really. I mean, it's as the wars go on, the battles get larger. But you're looking around about 25,000 men for the French and about 30,000 men for the Austrians, roughly. But you're looking at a very early proto-Napoleonic battle. I would say that Marengo is the first Napoleonic battle. So there you go. I've nailed my colours to the mast there. That's one of the reasons why I've never really researched the Italian campaign that much. Is I can't get them in my head as Napoleonic battles. Maybe I need to shift my thinking, but that's currently where I am. So for me, Marengo is the first fully capital N Napoleonic battle. Now, I've said that I was going to have a quick look at manufacturers afterwards. Obviously, the Perrys have started their French Revolution range. That's really good. Other manufacturers out there that do French or Batavians, because they're pretty much the same uniform, I would recommend Eureka. They do a range of French Revolutionary Wars. They are quite expensive, though, so just be aware of that. Same with Front Rank. Again, they can be quite expensive. However, I can't afford full metal armies these days. I don't know about you guys, but I would go with the early French from Victrix. To me, they are more than good enough. The dates given on the box are a bit later, but for me, they're absolutely fine. What I would be tempted to do, and what I probably will do, is mix in some metals with the plastic. So for argument's sake, I'm putting 6 figures to a base. Now, the French unit organisation was a little bit different back in those days, but let's say we're going for bases of 6 models. I'd probably go with 4 plastic models, 2 metal ones on that base. Now, you can either go with metal bicorns or those like weird sort of riding helmets that they wore, or tarletons even, or whatever, maybe an NCO from the command pack, whatever it is you want. I would probably go with 4 plastic to 2 metals, and I think I would keep that ratio across the army. For things like cuirassiers, you could use the Victrix heads on Perry cuirassier bodies. Obviously, carabiniers, they came later, so you wouldn't be able to use the carabiniers, but the hussars with mirlitons on, very usable. If you're going to go the British, they've got the British tarleton helmets in there, so you could do light dragoons quite easily. The heavy dragoons, they would come later, so you would perhaps have to use the Perry's ones for those. They do the Wellington in India or Wellington in Egypt range. Those models would be more than sufficient, so they're quite good. For the Russians, I mentioned Great War miniatures. They normally do very nice First World War models, but they do a range of Potemkin's troops as well. They're available via North Star, or I imagine Brigade, who also do a range of French Revolutionary Wars if you're in the States. So Brigade games, definitely one to look out for there. Early Prussians, you've got, of course, the Perrys. I'm not sure anyone does those in plastic yet. In fact, I'm certain no one does them in plastic, which is a bit of a shame. Maybe Wargames Atlantic might do one day, but at the moment, no, they are not available in plastic. Similarly, those Austrians in the baseball caps, absolutely same thing. If I was going smaller scale, if I was starting absolutely from scratch, I would probably look at AB Miniatures. They do models that cover that whole range. If I was going smaller still, I'd be looking at 50mm Essex models. They do ranges. A lot of people don't like the Essex. They've got a certain charm for me. Or you can look at Pendraken. And if you wanted to go down the Epic route, then you can go online if you have a printer or know someone who does. Then MC Miniatures on 3D Wargaming has got you covered. He's got every Napoleonic model known to man in Warlord Epic scale. They are absolutely fantastic. I've just printed their early or mid-war French, so I've been doing their Russians in greatcoats for a while. They are great as well. So there are plenty of options out there for early war. I hope I have given you some arguments as to why it's worth checking out. Even if that's not where you plunge directly to, if you're looking for some ideas for battles or you're just looking for something different to collect, then I hope that the early war is something that you are willing to look at. Currently there are no black powder rules for it, which is a shame, but I think you could probably jump online and some people would give you some pointers. As I suggest, the Revolutionary Army, you might be able to use the French, the Spanish, but I think that might be a little bit harsh to them. You might want to buff them up a little bit from there. But I hope you've enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for putting up with my absence for the last few weeks. I hope to see you at the live stream, not this Wednesday, but the Wednesday after. There will be another video before then, I hope. And I will see you guys next time.